I really don't understand how they're like homeless as in such, because everybody gets, if you don't have a job, you have unemployment, so you get income to be able to afford something, not to have to beg on the street and sleep in an alley or whatever. So what do they do with their income that they get? Surely they can go somewhere, cheap and get a room for a night or whatever.
Yeah, I think a lot of it may be self-inflicted. I mean, ordinary people have got jobs and they manage to live and survive.
If you talk to a homeless person, they seem to talk about the family that's broken up, and the financial situation that's led them to actually being on the streets. So sometimes it's not a choice to actually be there.
My dad, he worked for a bakery, Tip Top, I think, Tip Top Bakery, and he had an accident in 1979, which ended his life at the age of 26. So I had no role model. I didn't have that father figure. The community's got to just understand that, we made a wrong choice in life, and it sent us on a path that, it has to come to an end sooner or later.
When I was living in suburbia with my husband and children, I had no real idea about homelessness. It didn't really strike me until I felt I had to leave my husband because of his racist and sexist views. And then I basically fell into homelessness almost straight away because I went and lived in a car. I feel disadvantaged at being a woman from those times because I didn't go to university, which I'm really annoyed about because clearly I was smart enough. But all the focus was put onto my brother because he was a boy and my father thought he was brilliant. Whereas us girls, I've got 5 sisters, we were all quite smart as well. We were sort of ignored. I just feel like it was free then as well. Like I could have easily gone to university and I would have had a job that I liked.
I used to try and keep hidden away under bushes and stuff and wander around the place and, probably do more or less what I do now but with less comfort, basically. When I've been homeless, sometimes it's good to be ignored. Sometimes you just want people to leave you alone. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, ignoring homeless. I remember one incident where in another boarding house I was staying with, where I was sharing the toilet facilities, there was violence involving a crowbar going out on in the hallway, so I ended up urinating in an empty milk bottle that I had, rather than go, I didn't want to go out in the middle of a fight involving crowbars. So, they have a definition of homeless. We have primary, secondary, tertiary. Primary being sleeping under a tree, everyone agrees that's homeless. Couch surfing is also considered homeless because you're moving from one person's couch to the other night after night. And in a boarding house like this is considered tertiary level homelessness because you can basically be thrown out at any minute. So, it's sort of homeless, although I don't really think of this as homeless because I've got a roof over my head and, I've got 2 radio shows that I do now, the Roominations one and then another half-hour music show in the afternoon.
Good afternoon, my name is Spike and welcome to a special edition of 3CR's Roominations. Roominations is a radio program dedicated to housing and homelessness issues produced by people who are or have experienced homelessness. How does the community feel about homelessness and do we ignore homelessness?
Look, the answer's pretty straightforward, yes. It's hugely stigmatised. It's one of the most stigmatised identities you'll find. It's more stigmatised than, say, a mental illness. It's more stigmatised than drug use, even though those things are sort of combined in there. Couple of points to make though. One is that all homeless people experience that stigma. Now, the homeless population is very diverse. I mean, you'd know that. I mean, there's short-termers, there's long-termers. Not everyone's chronically homeless. And how people respond to that stigma is sort of interesting in some ways. A lot of people who are, particularly families who come into the homeless population, they tend to try and reject that identity. They try and distance themselves from other homeless people to not see themselves as the same. And they tend to use those sort of pejorative stereotypes that the public uses about the homeless.
To describe themselves.
Yeah, well, no, they use it to say, no, that's not us,
Okay.
that's them. So they actually actively distinguish themselves from the other homeless. So you see these interesting treatments around stigma in the homeless population itself. You know, the general community tend to think the reasons people become homeless are because of drug use and mental health problems. They don't sort of locate it in broader social and economic structures. So, look, the question is, how does the community treat the homeless? In the main, poorly.
Talking about stigma, I think there's some stigma around domestic violence which leads to homelessness. So it's something we still don't want to talk about a lot. It's still something that is not. It's sort of on the nose a bit. We don't want to. We don't want to acknowledge the fact that domestic violence is still a big issue in contemporary Australia, despite the advances of feminism. Women who end up in women's refuges, who then go into short-term housing, we just don't see that because of the rising cost of living in terms of finding a home. They're really stuck. I mean, if you're on the list for public housing, it's a 12-year waiting list.
34,000 people.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
So when someone suddenly finds themselves out of a home, and they're facing that news, it's a 12-year waiting list. And if you're new to this sort of area, you wouldn't know about things like cooperative housing or community housing, social housing alternatives. So then there's also a lot of guilt for women when they leave their husbands or partners, that they're taking their children away from, they're breaking the home.
So, Helen, from your perspective, give us an insight into the relationship between access to land and housing. And I suppose I'm trying to understand what role that plays in the community and in our economy and homelessness. Do you think that there's a relationship?
Oh, I think there's most certainly a relationship, especially for people like single mothers, etc. We've engineered a situation whereby the cost of housing is far in excess of what it should be. And the main reason for that is that we have these planning schemes which basically are rationing land. And if you ration land and there's more of a demand for the land than you allow to go onto the market, the price rises. Cost of housing is far in excess of what it should be. There's massive amounts of land in Australia. This isn't the Netherlands or Hong Kong or anywhere. We have massive amounts of land, but we have a planning fraternity here which limits the amount of land, and that raises the cost. Not only does that mean that people can't, or younger people can't afford to buy new houses, but it raises the cost of rents as well. There are consequences of saying we aren't going to allow that development in that area, and those consequences mean higher prices. And the real losers from this are those who don't own a house or need to rent a house.
In terms of homelessness, housing is not the solutions, just as a single factor. Because people, if they don't have the stable incomes, no matter how cheap or how the accommodations, they can't stay under the shelter.
Yeah.
And individuals have their own stories. They got the reason why they become homelessness.
You've got to sort of pick up this issue that homeless population is very diverse. You know, single men will tend to move in different ways than families tend to move. Families will tend to stay located in their areas. So there's all of these patterns, and it means that you need a very nuanced response to it. You know, and when you've spent years and years and years at the margin, you don't just suddenly become part of the mainstream again. It has enduring impacts, being homeless long term. Eventually, homelessness wears you down. You know, it just wears people down emotionally, physically, at so many different levels. You know, the fact that, you know, you live this sort of invisible life in some ways, it's not a good experience for people.
I've got dreams, I've got hope, and, you know, and I'm just one day at a time, I'm working towards it, you know. If I don't have hope, I've got nothing. I think hope's a good thing.
is gamble. Maybe gambling. We don't know.
You said gambling straight away. What makes you think gambling is a factor?
They think they're going to get rich when they're not.
Yeah, and just their situation, it's just hard to fathom. I don't think anyone chooses that direction. It's all to do with how they've been brought up, what situation they were already in when they started life, and I don't think they choose it. I don't think anyone would, to be honest.
A forest car. When I walk the streets